Hello, assalamu alaikum, and welcome to Power and Policy, a podcast by the Canadian Muslim Public Affairs Council aimed at engaging, informing, and empowering Canadian Muslims on the key issues shaping our country. I'm your host, Ginella Massa. Today we have a very special episode. Our guest is distinguished South African diplomat and human rights advocate, Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool. He is the former South African ambassador to the US. And this is a Canadian exclusive. It was shot on location in Toronto while he was here for a conference. And it's his first Canadian interview since he was expelled from the US back in March for comments he made about US President Donald Trump's administration. He was also at the forefront of supporting South Africa's efforts at the International Court of Justice to hold Israel accountable for his actions in Palestine. Thank you, Ambassador Rasool, for being with us today.
Thank you very much.
We're also joined here in studio by Khaled Alaz. He's the Executive Director of the Canadian Muslim Public Affairs Council, who is behind this podcast series, and he's going to join us in conversation a little bit later.
Thank you.
So I'll begin, Ambassador, by talking about the obvious parallels that there are between what's happening with the Palestinian struggles and South Africa's fight against apartheid. So talk to us a little bit about your perspective on what's happening in Gaza and, why you think these atrocities have been able to continue. What are the political dynamics that are at play that have allowed this? We know this is not new in the last 2 years. This is decades. But what has allowed it to continue to the extent that we have seen in the last year or two?
I think that the frenetic efforts we're seeing now, especially at this moment, to finish the job in Palestine, particularly through Gaza, comes because of a unique coalescing of circumstances, almost, if you want, a ideal balance of forces. If I were an Israeli leader at this moment and I look at the unconditional support I'm getting from Washington, I look at the kind of arms I'm getting from European capitals, and I look at the way in which I'm given the permission to really slaughter Palestinians, I think I'm on a good wicket. Secondly, if I look at the way in which the neighborhood of the Palestinians are being sucked into an agenda of normalization, the Abrahamic Accords, and the idea that they must recognize, but not just recognize Israel, they must work with Israel, they must support Israel, and they must abandon the Palestinians, then I would think that I'm really at a great moment. And so the permission that is given to Israel is for 3 massacres. The first one is what we are seeing on television, a genocide, the killing of a whole Palestinian genealogy. The second one is what is called in politics a patricide, the killing of a state, the killing of the very idea of a Palestinian state and country and homeland. The third one that they were very clear on after October 7 was the killing of the truth. They thought they could erase an entire history of occupation from 1948 by only focusing on October the 7th. And fortunately, South Africa's action by taking Israel and charging it with genocide at the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, turned that third massacre around because we used the ICJ as a platform to proclaim a truth to the world. And it is that truth that has created an urgency today. The truth that we have projected to the world is that Israel is not the victim, it is the perpetrator. That the occupation didn't start on the October 7, it started in 1948. That the number of Palestinians killed has really, and it brought in evidence from across the world. And so we were able to put that, and the result was that the streets and the campuses turned against the Western capitals, that the streets had to be subdued in the Middle East to protect the palace from complicity. And so all in all, I think that the frenetic way in which the massacre is currently taking place is because Netanyahu has been told you've got a short time to finish the job towards your final solution. And that is why they are not regarding any ceasefire, any deals, not even allowed. So some Palestinians must starve to death, others will be bombed to death. And that, I think, is the game plan.
Mm. You raised some interesting points that touch on the next question I was gonna ask you, and that has to do with sort of the success or the results of this ICJ case. Did it have the efforts that you had hoped it would on the international stage? Because you talk about there's the legal implications, and then there's the airing of the truth.
So we were a little bit surprised, pleasantly surprised legally, when we looked at the ICJ. There are 15 judges. We needed 8 of them to agree that there's a prima facie case of genocide. We got 14 of the 15 to say that, and we got an interim order that Israel is disregarding by and large, but we got an interim order. It was that stamp of 14 of 15 ICJ judges that inflamed the truth across the world. Because who better to call it an interim genocide than the 14 judges of the ICJ? And that's what gave the streets and the campuses courage to stand up, and other countries, surprisingly, like Spain and Ireland. Not many Muslim countries, but certainly 2 European countries were very important. And so that is a symbolic legal victory, but its popular victory is that the truth spread across the world, and this has shortened um, the lifespan of this bombardment, and hence Netanyahu fighting both for his political life and for his ultimate objective of eradicating the Palestinian people and the Palestinian state.
I want to talk a little bit more about specifically what's happening right now and what we can do to stop it, as we say, this intensifying of what's happening. I'm going to put a pin in it for a moment because I want to talk a little bit about speaking the truth. We're talking about airing the truth, and that can get a lot of people in trouble. And I want to talk a little bit about your specific situation in the U.S. You were the ambassador previously under President Barack Obama, 2010 to 2015. You returned this year under President Trump. You got in a little bit of hot water for comments that you made during a seminar or an online webinar that had saw you expelled from the U.S. for speaking about white supremacy under Trump. The Secretary of State called you a hater of America, a hater of Trump. Did you know when you were making those comments that this could be a sticky situation for you? Did you expect the result that you saw?
The declaration of me as a persona non grata, an unwelcome person, was not unexpected in the sense that the attacks on me started the day it was announced in November already that I was going to be the ambassador. It was that day that former South Africans who are very close in the US inner circles in the administration started to call me a terrorist, a Hamas supporter, etc., etc. And so I was always going to be up against it. Um, and South Africa was always going to be up against it simply because of the case that it launched in the ICJ. That's the precondition for any trade and investment discussions, that you drop the case in the ICJ. And as a countermeasure to our charging Israel with genocide, President Trump charged South Africa with conducting a genocide against its white population, particularly its Afrikaner population, and therefore inviting our former oppressors, our white supremacists, to come to the USA as refugees. Now that's bizarre. And so my comments were not particularly rude and crude. It was analytical.
What
It,
did you say?
I basically said that we are dealing with 3 intersecting supremacisms to explain the situation. Because you've got a MAGA supremacism that President Trump is at the heart of. It's a white supremacism. It's intersecting with old South African, Afrikaner supremacism, people who lost power in South Africa and now locating themselves with a white power structure in the USA. And that was intersecting with a Zionist supremacism that we were directly attacking and they were counteracting against us. And the point of the matter is, there's nothing crude and rude about what I said. It was in its veracity that it threatened the White House. because everyone thinks Trump is just some crazy guy. But you've got to understand what method there is in his madness, how he's driving those white supremacist ideologies, what's behind it. It's the search for critical minerals. And Greenland isn't some figment of the imagination. It is because it is the access to the critical minerals of the Arctic Circle as the ice is melting. Panama isn't just some, if you look at taking over the Panama Canal together with bombing the Houthis, it's to open the trade routes for these resources to flow. So, and why particularly as South African? Because we are the last country to have tried to defeat supremacism. When something smells supremacist, it's probably that. When it looks supremacist, it's probably that. When it sounds supremacist, it's probably that. And it's particularly South African ears that are attuned to the siren songs of supremacism that made us see things that the world is only now beginning to see.
To that end, you know, you're seen as you said, there's nothing, crazy about what you said, but you are seen as outspoken, bold. I mean, the move South Africa is making. Do you think that we need to see more politicians, more people in the international community taking a stronger stance, particularly in the West, in Canada, the US, to speak out about what's happening? For example, in Gaza, what's happening in the US. Do you think we need to see stronger stances from the international community on these issues?
I think that Gaza and Palestine is probably the moral issue of our time. Like apartheid in South Africa was the moral issue of the late 20th century. Vietnam was the moral issue before that. Segregation in the USA was the moral issue. Every era has a defining moral dilemma that must be solved. And as Bertolt Brecht taught us, unhappy is the land that needs a hero. When there is such deep unhappiness in the world, this is not the moment to be afraid. This is the moment of heroism. This is the moment where good people stand up. This is the moment when you've got to raise your voice. And truth must be spoken in real time. When you speak the truth in a past tense, you are nostalgic. When you speak the truth in the future tense, you are procrastinating. And so the point is, Surah Al-Asr says that the truth must be spoken in the real time. And when you speak the truth, be prepared for sabr, for resilience, because it invites a response. And we're not saying everyone must be reckless, because the Prophet ﷺ was not reckless when speaking the truth, he was strategic. And so we're not asking everyone to shed their blood for Gaza, because sometimes we need people's akal, their strategic wisdom. Sometimes we need people's soul to be expressed in it. Sometimes what we need from Canadians would be, for example, not to go and die on the streets, but to make sure the government chooses the right positions, that you have a government that will choose the right side of history all the time. And that's maybe the strategic task that we would ask of, for example, Canadians or Americans. And that's the role that the South African Muslim Ummah is playing in keeping its government on the right side of history.
I think this is a perfect time to bring in Khaled Alaz. He's the executive director of the Canadian Muslim Public Affairs Council. You help facilitate this conversation. You've spoken, Ambassador, as a mentor. Why was it so important for you to create an opportunity to draw these parallels and to learn from what we have seen from folks like him?
So thank you, Janella, for this question and this interview. And I will bring in three intersections that I believe our Muslim community is interested in that are very relevant to this conversation. And one is basically that you have a community that is part of this ummah that is speaking with the suffering of our brothers and sisters in Palestine on day-to-day basis. And you're looking for ways to engage and be part of the solution, be part of ending this crisis, and uh, that is intersecting with the moral courage showed by South Africa and celebrated by our community, and gave it a reason and inspiration to act in ways that are meaningful and opening doors to name things the way they are, plausible genocide, as the Court of Justice has put it. On the third dimension, it is also invited our community to start looking to political engagement and involvement with the community, as Ambassador Rasool said, is basically pressuring the government in ways that the community did not do before. And that, as we saw over this past election, the community stood out clearly, sending political messages to the government that this is not a community that's going to be taken for granted, a community that is rooted in principles and rooted in their compassion with human rights and respect for international law, with very high expectations of what the moral position of this government, principled leadership, and taking the right side in history.
And to that end, and we've just had a federal election. We have a new prime minister. CMPAC was heavily involved in mobilizing Muslim community in taking a moral stance as they head to the polls to cast their ballot. And I think we saw the impact of that in the results. So how do we continue now? How do we make sure that we maintain that consistent pressure? What's the message to not just Canadian Muslims, but anyone of conscience, anyone who believes in human rights and social justice, to make sure that our government stands up to its own standards of human rights and social justice?
Yeah, as you said, Janela, this is exactly what was the focus of our campaign, with the Muslims Vote campaign that we ran. That basically we lobbied our community and brought the community together as one block to advocate for the issues of the time, issues of interest of our community now, and Gaza was at the center of this. And interestingly, Gaza for Canadian Muslims and many in the wider Canadian society was not only a foreign policy issue, it was a clear domestic issue that impacts the values, the principles, the root of democracy that we live by, and the principles that govern all our interactions. So Gaza was a bigger issue than just a foreign policy issue that people look externally to. And the community was able to send that political message, even though it was avoided by the two major parties. And it was put on the agenda. Over 25 candidates from the Liberty Party ran on a ticket that basically was clearly and publicly supporting the Palestinian policy demands. Our campaign endorsed 30 candidates who basically were supportive and friendly to our community and had a chance to win. 23 of those actually won a position in parliament. 4 of the people were elected into the new government that we have endorsed, which means, one, basically standing up for Palestine is no longer a toxic issue. Is no longer an issue that ends your political career. 2, the government, there is hope that they would realign, as you said, with their international commitments, with their position, with their actually outspoken foreign policy, and prioritize that over any special interest or any political balance that politicians do. So the expectation that the community continues to take those politicians to account for these positions, take the government and advocate that the government continues to make the right decisions and the right choices.
And I'd like you to reflect back, on your time in the ANC, in the UDF. I mean, you served jail time. You were under house arrest. I mean, you saw the real, some of the horrible potential implications of speaking up and being involved in this work. So, what's your message to those who want to stand up, want to be vocal, but are afraid about the potential, either political implications, their career implications, their education? What's your message?
My message is to find the balance between what the Ummah requires of its Muslim members in Canada, because the long-term reason for Muslims being in Canada and in the West is to recover the lost property of the believers, is to recover the algorithms that Al-Khawarizmi had started, to learn from the way in which the West has applied the algebra that was also Al-Khawarizmi's legacy. So we are here to recover the lost property and to revive the Islamic civilization with real knowledge and skills. At the same time, our conscience is being pressurized by an immediate a genocide that we see. So where is the meeting point between our long-term embedding in Canadian society in order to keep the government on track and our immediate outrage? And so that's the point of wisdom that we are looking for. How do we protest? How do we advocate? How do we pressurize? How do we vote? How do we become leaders of Canada in the same way that South African Muslims earned leadership in South Africa with blood, sweat, and tears? We went to jail, we were martyred, we died on the streets, we were tortured to death, and therefore we earned being the title Al Amin, the trustworthy, because our trust was built on blood, sweat, and tears. And therefore we could now become Rasulullah, the messengers of God. If you don't have the sequence right, you lose track. Secondly, I would say that what we need from Canadian Muslims, amongst others, is the ability um, to mobilize its society. It's easier to mobilize society than it is to mobilize government. Government gets funded by lobby groups. Candidates get funded by particular rich people. We don't have that kind of wealth necessarily, and therefore the idea of an impact Muslim Public Affairs Council is absolutely critical, that we need that leverage. But until we have that leverage, and even when we have that leverage, mobilizing Canadian society is easier because the fitra in ordinary citizens is more than the interests of leaders of society. And so the campuses, so the communities, the churches. And so what we need to be able to do is to be very active there, not make Palestine a Muslim issue, but a human issue. To intersperse Allahu Akbar with Canadian chants, like we did Amandla Gawe, to power to the people. To be able to ask of Canadian people things which are within their capacity. Don't ask them to boycott 1,000 products. Find 5 products that if all Canadians, Muslim and non-Muslim, were to boycott those 5 products, the impact would be enormous. Sometimes we want to take our level of solidarity with the Palestinians, which are both ethnic and religious, and impose it on other people which are beyond them, and they do nothing. Let's find workable campaigns that can work. If we do BDS, let's identify the products that would hurt Israel the most. So I would say practical leadership, wise leadership is going to be absolutely crucial. And we must lead society, ordinary citizens, while we try to work a way of influence towards the government.
Before we run out of time, Ambassador, let me ask you to leave us with a message of hope, because I think a lot of people are feeling a lot of despair, especially these last couple of weeks and months, where we've seen the ramping up, and as you talked about, this sort of acting with impunity, and feeling like, how does this end? What will be the tipping point? How do you see this ending? I mean, South Africa was able to emerge from apartheid. Of course, there are still challenges in today, and ripple effects of that. But how do you see this playing out, and how do you see this ending?
You know, hope comes in the most unusual package. In South Africa in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, more people died in that decade than in the whole of the apartheid situation. Because as the oppressor, the supremacist, the exploiter, the tyrant, as the tyrant goes to his grave, he takes more lives. He imposes more punishment. His harshness knows no bounds. And ironically, that for us was the sign, what we call then the last kicks of the dying horse. He will try to take as many to the grave. So it's ironic that suffering increases proportional to the demise of the tyrant.
It's darkest before the dawn.
Absolutely. Netanyahu will try to finish the job using his last breath to impose and to eradicate the Palestinians. But in that is the sign of his end. And Allah's condition is, فَإِنَّ مَعَ أُسْرِ يُسْرًا إِنَّ مَعَ أُسْرِ يُسْرًا. Verily, not after difficulty comes ease. It is through difficulty that ease is born. And so we mustn't mistake the difficulty and the harshness and the deaths and the killings as the sign of our defeat. It's actually the sign of their defeat. When they don't try to kill us, then we must be worried that we are ineffective, that we are not bothering them.
Mm. Ambassador Rasool, thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights, for your important work, and for sharing your words of wisdom. Khaled, thank you so much for facilitating this conversation and continuing to empower Canadian Muslims and Canadians of conscience to keep fighting for justice for all. Thank you both for this conversation.
Thank you, Ginella.
Thank you for watching Power and Policy. This is a podcast by the Canadian Muslim Public Affairs Council. Be sure to like, subscribe, comment, and share this podcast. We want you to stay engaged, informed, and empowered. Until next time, I'm your host, Ginella Massa. Assalamu alaikum.